They say Red Bull gives you wings, and if we're being honest, some of the cars they have built for Formula One are the closest they have ever gotten to making that true. Welcome back to Grid Chat, your one-stop shop for everything Formula One. I'm your host, Marissa Tandon, and right now, while there are no cars on track, we're doing an educational series. The idea behind the series is that whether you are completely brand new to the sport, or you've been watching for a while, any questions you might have about the basics of this sport will be answered. There is no wrong way to find Formula One, there's no wrong way to get into Formula One, and there are no stupid or bad questions when it comes to getting into this sport. And after covering Formula One this past season, I realized that so many people have so many of the same questions. So this basic series is called Grid Chat University, and every week we've been covering a different part of the sport. So far, we've already covered how the championships work, why we have two of them, what the point system is, what the format of a race weekend is, a lot of the jobs that come together to make this sport possible, and now we are at one of the most fun parts of Formula One. Because being a fan of Formula One gets better just like any other sport when you have a team to root for and a whole bunch of people to root against. So this week and next week, we are doing individual episodes for each of the teams on the grid, because the only way to decide whether a team is for you or not is an honest and deep vibe check. So you can consider these episodes just that, a vibe check. You'll get to know a little bit about the history of the team, how it came to be, iconic moments in their past, and the current state of affairs for their future. Hopefully each of these episodes will give you an idea of the culture of the team and help you decide whether or not you think you would be a fit to be a fan. Think about it as sort of like a crash course, but maybe more of like a don't crash course. So far this week, we covered McLaren and Ferrari, and today it's time to talk about Red Bull Racing. Now, this team is one of the most dominant in recent history on the grid. So we're going to talk a little bit about their history, which is shorter than the last two teams that we've talked about so far. Some of the moments in their past, one of my favorite stories, which involves a heist. Yes, you heard me correctly, a heist in Formula One, and the full circle nature of this team. We'll also talk about a few of their iconic drivers from the past, and of course, we'll be getting into their current four-time world champion, Max Verstappen. So let's buckle up, because it's time to talk about Red Bull Racing. Red Bull Racing, as we know it, didn't start until 2005, but the team itself actually started in 1997. This is the first team that we're going to talk about that has a little bit of changed history like this. Both McLaren and Ferrari, which we've talked about in the last two episodes, are more of like legacy teams. They have been a part of this sport for so long. Ferrari from the very beginning, or almost the very beginning, as you know we talked about last episode, and McLaren has been a part of the sport for the second longest amount of time on the grid. But the team that we know as Red Bull Racing was actually originally called Stewart Grand Prix. That team was started by Jackie Stewart, who also was actually, just like Sir Lewis Hamilton, knighted. Sir John Young Jackie Stewart was actually a pretty accomplished Formula One racing driver. He raced in Formula One from 1965 to 1973, and during that time he won 3 World Drivers' Championships. Those championships were in 1969, 1971, and 1973. Those 3 championships actually made him the only British driver to have won 3 World Drivers' Championships in Formula One. That is until Lewis Hamilton tied his record in 2015. As we know, Lewis Hamilton did go on to win 4 more championships, hitting that 7, but it's pretty impressive to hold a record from 1973 until 2015. Stewart Grand Prix, which Jackie was the team principal of and started with his son, was supported by Ford. The team only competed in 3 seasons under that name, 1997, 1998, and 1999. And during that time, there were actually a couple of famous last names you may recognize from the modern day Formula One grid. During their debut season, one of their drivers was Jan Magnussen, and you may recognize that last name because he is the father of Kevin Magnussen. And the following season, Magnussen was actually replaced with another familiar last name. Jos Verstappen, Max Verstappen's father, replaced him in the middle of the 1998 season. But at the end of the 1999 season, Ford actually bought out the team from the Stewarts, and they decided to rebrand the team as Jaguar Racing. Now, Ford operated the team as Jaguar through the 2004 season, and 2004 has one of my favorite moments in Formula One history. This is where we get into, to my knowledge, the only heist that has ever happened in Formula One. Now, I need you to travel back in time with me. The year is 2004, and the worst sequel to the best movie that has ever been made is coming out. If you're not exactly picking up what I'm putting down, the movie I'm referencing is Ocean's 12. Now, in Formula One, it is not uncommon for teams to have sponsors that are only there for one race. This sometimes means that there is a special livery involved, and it has not been an uncommon practice for that special livery of a one-time sponsorship to be for a movie that is premiering soon. At the time, Jaguar Racing was not doing very well. Financially, things were just not working, and it was becoming clear that they needed to come up with something soon. And boy, did they come up with something unique. Now, if you're not familiar with the Ocean's 11 franchise, the movies star a lot of really big names, including George Clooney, Brad Pitt, Matt Damon, Don Cheadle. The list truly goes on. And these movies are heist movies. During the first movie, they rob 3 casinos, the Bellagio, the Mirage, and the MGM Grand. And in the second movie, they go to Europe. Now, the first movie had been such a hit that the second movie was expected to also be pretty splashy. And of course, at the center of the film was a trio of movie stars that we know very well. And so Jaguar came up with a marketing strategy. For one race only at the Monaco Grand Prix, Jaguar would be sponsored by the movie Ocean's 12. Matt Damon, George Clooney, and Brad Pitt would attend the Monaco Grand Prix. They would take pictures with the drivers and with the cars, and this would be great press for both teams. However, as I mentioned, Jaguar was in pretty dire straits, and they needed something other than just the name of a movie and a couple of movie stars to take pictures. So they really tapped into the idea of the Monaco Grand Prix and the idea of flashy diamonds. As part of the special livery, they decided to embed a diamond worth over $250,000 into the nose cone of each vehicle. And if you haven't heard this story, you're probably thinking what I was the first time I heard this story. Not a real diamond, right? Or maybe they just put the diamonds in for pictures and then they were going to take them out before they got back on track. Nobody in their right mind would embed two $250,000 diamonds into the nose cone of Formula One cars and then send them out onto the Monaco Grand Prix racetrack. Right? Wrong. As part of this stunt, the whole point was that the diamonds would actually be racing at Monaco. In addition to the two nose cones that would be racing, they actually needed multiple nose cones should anything need to be changed. So in total, there were 5 diamonds on loan from a jeweler, and those diamonds were embedded in the nose cones of the Jaguar vehicles. Brad Pitt, George Clooney, and Matt Damon all came, they posed with the drivers, and they posed with their diamonds. And by all accounts, the beginning of the race weekend starts out pretty well. They get through free practice, and they even get through qualifying. No incidents. And pretty much everybody is thinking, man, this really worked out. This is a really good idea. We got 3 movie stars, we got diamonds. We are going to solve some of our marketing problems until we get to the race itself. Not even a full lap into the race, Christian Klein, one of the drivers, crashes into the wall. If you actually look at footage of this crash from 2004, the Monaco Grand Prix, it's not even a very intense crash. Everybody was fine, nobody was harmed, except he had, of course, crashed into the barrier nose cone first. And even as quickly as the marshals responded to the incident, the diamond itself was never recovered. There are a ton of theories about what may have actually happened. One of the theories being that the diamond itself had been pocketed by one of the marshals, another being that the diamond had flown off into the stands and some lucky fan found it, and a third conspiracy theory is that the team and the filmmakers had orchestrated the entire thing. It's hard to say which of the 3 is true, especially given that the value of the marketing of actually losing the diamond and the amount of people that talked about it afterwards, news coverage and everything like that. I mean, even me, 21 years later talking about this on a podcast, the value of that actually exceeded the $250,000 of the diamond. The one thing that was made very clear, though, is that the diamonds were not insured. As the marketing director of Jaguar said at the time, nobody was going to insure diamonds to go Grand Prix racing. As objectively brilliant as this marketing stunt was, unfortunately, it was not enough to save the team. And at the end of the 2004 season, Ford Motor Company had determined that there was not a viable way to continue the team. They sold the team to Red Bull Racing for $1, along with a commitment from Red Bull that they would invest $400 million into the team over the next 3 years. And so in 2005, Red Bull Racing as we know it today was formed. And Christian Horner, who is still the team principal today, was the team principal installed in 2005. The drivers for that inaugural season of Red Bull Racing ironically included the diamond loser, Christian Klein, as well as a name and voice that you are familiar with in Formula One, David Coulthard. He also goes by DC. Now, one thing to note is that Red Bull had already been involved in Formula One as a sponsor. They previously sponsored Sauber, but when they bought the Formula One team from Ford, they obviously stopped sponsoring another team. Despite a strong first season under the Red Bull banner, the team did struggle overall for a few years. However, one thing to note is that in 2005, they hired Adrian Newey. Adrian Newey at the time had been the technical director for McLaren, and this marked his official move over to Red Bull, where he would stay until 2024. And 2009 is the first season we really see that partnership start to flourish. At the time, Sebastian Vettel is driving for Red Bull, and that season they finished runner-up in both championships to Braun GP. Now, Braun GP is a team that you will want to hear about, and we'll be talking about them tomorrow in the Mercedes episode. But by the end of the 2009 season, Red Bull was really the only team that was able to catch up to Braun, even though they weren't actually able to surpass them. However, starting the following year in 2010, we start the very first extreme era of Red Bull dominance. Red Bull wins the Constructors and Drivers' Championship for the next 4 seasons. 2010, 2011, 2012, and 2013 all go to Red Bull. Those championships were won with Sebastian Vettel, who's one of the bigger iconic names in Formula One history. Vettel parted ways with the team after that and headed over to Ferrari, but before he did, we saw the next kind of big name in Red Bull history. Daniel Ricciardo was promoted from Toro Rosso, which you may know now as VCarb, or I believe this year as RB. The name continues to change, but Daniel Ricciardo was an Australian driver who drove for their junior team, and in 2014 he was promoted up to Red Bull Racing alongside Sebastian Vettel, replacing Mark Webber. Daniel Ricciardo is one of the drivers that I think is really familiar to this newest era of Formula One fans. He was introduced to so many people through the Drive to Survive era, but he also kind of marks an energy of a little more personal and goofy behavior when it comes to Formula One drivers and the way that they present themselves. Daniel Ricciardo has a number of really nice moments with Red Bull, including his first win at the Canadian Grand Prix and a win at the historic Monaco Grand Prix circuit. Daniel is definitely a rising star, but devastatingly, at a certain point, every star ends up going out. And sometimes that happens because new stars are on the block. In 2016, a then 18-year-old Max Verstappen is promoted to to be Daniel's teammate, and he wins his very first race with Red Bull at the Spanish Grand Prix. Winning that race made him the youngest ever Grand Prix race winner in Formula One history. And as we see his star start to rise, we also see Daniel start to feel a little stress about the pressure. In 2018, Daniel announces that he'll be going to Renault for the 2019 season, thus closing that chapter on Red Bull racing, though it did not end that day. During this period of time, all the way through 2020, Mercedes and Lewis Hamilton are the team that cannot be beaten. But Max Verstappen and Red Bull continue to work on their team in order to get themselves to the point where they can start to challenge them. Now, a couple of things that I think come through this history that are rather important when it comes to the culture of Red Bull. Red Bull has a history of going through drivers quite quickly. As soon as drivers have proven that they cannot handle the pressure of being on this team, it is not uncommon for those drivers to be replaced quickly, sometimes even in the middle of a season. After Daniel Ricciardo leaves the team in 2019, Red Bull also makes a couple of other changes. They drop Renault as their engine supplier, and Renault sort of takes their driver as compensation and instead begins the Honda era of Red Bull racing. At the same time, they promote someone who may be familiar to you, Pierre Gasly, from their junior team up to be Max Verstappen's teammate. Pierre's promotion also opens up a space for a driver named Alex Albon, and he starts his rookie year on Red Bull's junior team. However, Pierre does not even keep that seat for the full season. He's quickly demoted back down to the junior team, and rookie Alex Albon is promoted in his stead. In 2020, we start to see Max as a genuine challenge to Lewis, but Alex is not able to keep pace, and he's not even demoted, he's just dropped at the end of the 2020 season. Heading into 2021, Max's new teammate is someone outside of that Red Bull camp, and he's someone that you may have heard a lot about this past year, Checo Perez. Now, if you just started watching Formula One this past season, you may not be aware of how dominant Max Verstappen and Checo Perez were as a team for a couple of years. Their first season together in 2021, Max actually wins his first driver's title. Now, I'm not going to get super into it, but this title is one that is pretty contentious amongst the fandom, and it was won on the very last race in 2021 due to a call made by the stewards. That call was very controversial and has gone back and forth on whether or not it was acceptable, and it's also the source of the memes that you have definitely seen of Toto Wolff smashing his headphones onto the table. Regardless, in 2021, Max wins that first driver's championship, and in 2022, they are back on top with the Constructors' Championship. Max and Checo then work together for 2022 and 2023, taking home the Constructors' title for both years and driver's titles for Max as well. Then comes the rough season of 2024. What started out pretty strong eventually starts to fall apart. Checo's performance was not at all what they were looking for this year, and there were talks throughout the entire season of him being dropped. Ultimately, they end up finishing third in the Constructors' Championship, but Max takes home his fourth world title. And at the end of the season, it was announced that Checo would be parting ways with the team and would be replaced with Liam Lawson. Now, before we get into those two drivers and a couple of things that you might want to know about them if Red Bull is going to be your team, I do want to point out a full circle moment. Ford Performance has returned to Red Bull. While Honda has been a successful engine partner throughout the past couple of years, Ford and Red Bull came back together for their powertrains. And starting in 2026, Ford will return as the engine supplier for Red Bull. Honda will depart and head over to Aston Martin, and there's something kind of full circle about Ford returning to Formula One with the same team that they sold to Red Bull for just $1 back in 2004. And as a small personal aside, I will say I had one of the coolest experiences I've ever had in Formula One with Red Bull and Ford Performance. I was actually a guest of Pepe Jeans, one of Red Bull's sponsors. They also sponsor a Formula One Academy car, and as part of my experience, Ford Performance actually gave me a hot lap experience. If you'd like to see more about what that was like, there is a video on my YouTube channel all about my experience with Red Bull racing, the vibes at Silverstone, and what it was like to do a hot lap at Silverstone on a wet track in a Ford Mustang Dark Horse. Spoiler alert, we did in fact overtake a McLaren on track. Anyway, if you'd like to see what that's like and some of the power behind these cars, you can check that out on my YouTube channel. Now that we've covered a lot of the history of Red Bull, let's get into the modern day Formula One team. As I mentioned, Checo Perez will no longer be a driver for the team, and choosing his replacement was quite an ordeal. There were a lot of different people up for the job. For a period of time, we thought that actually might be the return of Daniel Ricciardo. Daniel Ricciardo was actually driving for the junior team last year, but was dropped rather abruptly mid-season for Liam Lawson. Then we thought the driver replacement might be Yuki Tsunoda, given the fact that he had been with the team for a long period of time, but ultimately the decision was to promote Liam Lawson. So let's talk briefly about the driver pairing that we're going to have starting this year. I've already talked a lot about Max's accomplishments, but a couple of other things to note. Max was actually the youngest driver to debut in Formula One at 17 years old, and he's had an incredibly successful run. As I mentioned earlier in this episode, his dad was actually driving for the original team before it was Red Bull Racing, and Max has been the complete focus of this team since he was promoted, with obviously pretty good reason as he has won 4 drivers' titles despite this past year where the car was not performing to the best of its abilities. And one thing you should know about Max is that if you choose him as your driver, you're in for a lot of expletives and wild behavior. Max is known for being very aggressive on track, sometimes to the point of pushing limits of sportsmanship. He's also known for pretty explicit and aggressive messages over the radio, and for getting into fights with the FIA. However, Max is also a very great driver, obviously, a once-in-a-generation talent, and in my opinion, maybe one of the funniest drivers on the grid. Max has a full second career as as a sim racer and recently announced that he's expecting his first child. Max is the type of driver that you should pick to be your driver if you believe in winning above all else, cutthroat mentality, and a good sarcastic joke here and there. Now let's talk about Liam Lawson. This is Liam's first full season in Formula One, but he's actually been a part of the Red Bull camp for a long time. Liam is from New Zealand, his favorite movie is Cars, and he credits Lightning McQueen as being the reason he got into race car driving. Now Liam got his first chance in a Formula One car back when Daniel Ricciardo actually made his return to the Red Bull camp. Back in 2023, Daniel Ricciardo was without a seat after being dropped by McLaren, and he was brought back by Red Bull as a reserve driver. However, they had also hired Nick de Vries to drive for their junior team, and after a period of poor performance, they decided to drop him mid-season and replace him with Daniel Ricciardo. But very quickly, Daniel actually was in an accident where he broke his wrist, and he was unable to drive for a number of races. Liam Lawson, another one of their reserve drivers at the time, got his first chance to race in Formula One. Now, one of the things that people always reference when they talk about Liam Lawson and why he's so impressive is the fact that he actually was able to knock Max out of Q3 in one of his races. This is something that you'll hear referenced a lot, but Liam also had an impressive junior career and definitely earned his spot in this Red Bull space. This past season, he replaced Daniel Ricciardo for the back half of the season, and at the end of the season was awarded the Red Bull seat for this year. The real question will be how he meshes with the rest of the team, as he did get into some on-track disagreements with Fernando Alonso and Checo Perez this past season. However, I am definitely very excited to see how he does, and personally, I think it's important to give everybody a shot at showing off what they can do before we blame them for taking away a seat from someone that we like. All of that being said, a couple of things that you might want to take away from Red Bull to remember in case you want to be a fan. Just because your favorite driver has a seat there does not mean that they are secure. Red Bull has a reputation for being cutthroat above all else and wanting to win. If you decide to be a Red Bull fan and your favorite driver is on that team and they are not performing at the capacity that they need to be, it is very possible that they will no longer have a job. But on the flip side, as a fan, Red Bull gives you a lot of opportunities to do one really big thing, and that is usually win. Though this past year really did fall apart for them, it's highly possible that in the next couple of years we will see them kind of get their life back together. Red Bull also has a very lively fandom, pretty great social media content, and objectively a culture of champions. I would say you can't go wrong choosing Red Bull as your team unless you have your feelings hurt easily. So hopefully today's episode has told you a little bit about the storied history of Red Bull, some full circle moments about their past and their present, and helped you decide whether or not Red Bull might be the team for you. If you've already decided that Red Bull is the team for you, I would love to know why. And if you haven't, let me know how Red Bull stacks up against McLaren and Ferrari so far. If you have any questions about this episode, previous episodes, or anything about Formula One in general, be sure to send those questions in, as throughout this basic series, I'm doing a series of question and answer sessions. Kind of think of those as office hours in school. It's your chance to ask anything that you may have wanted to know before and have it explained to you in a way that is not condescending and hopefully helps you understand. You can send those questions in a number of ways. If you're watching this episode on YouTube, you can just leave it in the comment section down below. And if you're listening to this episode elsewhere, you can go to the YouTube version of this episode and leave your questions there, or you can find me on social media. I am at Marissa on Instagram, TikTok, and Threads, and you can send your questions in via any of those platforms. You can also send your questions in by joining our Discord server. During the season, we actually use that server to watch races together, which is really nice if you don't have any other fans of Formula One in your life. During the off season, we are using it to get excited and fangirl and shout about things that are going on in the world of Formula One, and also for you to get episode notifications and ask any questions that you might have. So if you have any questions, make sure to send them in that way, and I'll see you tomorrow when class is back in session for us to talk about Mercedes.